Sometimes the most broken among us become the strongest shields for those who need protecting most. In the windswept fishing village of Svolvær, Norway, where the North Sea crashes against ancient cliffs and old stories still whisper through the winter darkness, a solitary blacksmith named Erik Thornson had spent 3 years avoiding the world. His forge, once filled with the laughter of his young daughter Astrid, had become a tomb of memory and regret. On the night when the aurora borealis painted the sky in violent greens and purples, Erik heard something impossible, a child's cry cutting through the howling blizzard. What he found in that storm would challenge everything he believed about life, death, and second chances. A little girl, no more than 8, wandering barefoot through snow that should have killed her, speaking in a language that died with the Vikings. When Erik asked who had hurt her, her answer would connect his shattered present to a brutal past that somehow refused to stay buried. But here's what nobody expected, including Erik himself. Sometimes the dead don't come back for revenge. Sometimes they come back to heal the living. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hook. The child's voice pierced through the storm like a blade through ice, speaking words that should not exist in any living throat. Der brendu heimili mitt, der drapu modor mina. Erik Thornson stood frozen in his doorway, the warmth of his forge bleeding out into the frigid night as he stared at the impossible sight before him. The girl couldn't be more than 8 years old, her dark hair matted with blood and snow, her small frame wrapped in what appeared to be rough-spun wool and leather, clothing that belonged in a museum, not on a living child in 2023. "Skal dig?" he asked again in modern Norwegian, his blacksmith's hands trembling as he reached toward her. "Who hurt you?" Her pale blue eyes met his, ancient and knowing in a way that made his chest tighten with recognition he couldn't name. When she spoke again, the Old Norse flowed from her lips like a song of sorrow. "Der komu medskip, brendu alt. Eg for I bertu, and eg get ekki funded heim after. They came with ships, burned everything. I hid, but I cannot find home again." Erik's knees nearly buckled. He had studied Old Norse in university, before life had narrowed to the rhythm of hammer on steel and the weight of unbearable loss, before his world had burned just as surely as this child described. "You're safe now," he whispered in Norwegian, then struggled to remember the ancient words. "Hert orug nuna." The girl tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that seemed to see straight through his weathered exterior to the broken father beneath. Snow continued to fall around her bare feet, yet she showed no signs of the hypothermia that should have claimed her life hours ago. "Thu ert ein sorg fadir min," she said softly. "You are like my father." The words hit Erik like a physical blow. For 3 years, no child had spoken to him. For 3 years, he had made sure of it. Children reminded him of Astrid's laughter, echoing through these same rooms. Children reminded him of his failure to save the one person who had mattered most. But this child was different. This child spoke of burning homes and lost fathers in a language that predated the very stones of his village. This child stood in a blizzard that should have killed her, looking at him with eyes that held the weight of centuries. "Come inside," he managed, switching back to Norwegian. "Before you freeze." She followed him into the forge without hesitation, her bare feet making no sound on the stone floor. The fire cast dancing shadows across her face, and Erik noticed details that made his stomach clench with unease. Her clothes weren't old-fashioned. They were authentic down to the hand-sewn seams and the bronze clasp at her shoulder. The blood in her hair was real, fresh, though he could see no wound beneath it. "What's your name?" he asked, settling her on a wooden stool near the fire. "Sigrid Eriksdotter," she replied, then added in halting Norwegian, as if the modern language required effort. "I am daughter of Erik Ironborn." Erik. The shared name sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the winter cold. "My name is Erik, too." She nodded, as if this was not a coincidence, but a confirmation of something she already knew. Tuat her tilad hjalpa mer. You are here to help me. As he moved to fetch blankets and warm milk, Eric caught sight of his reflection in the blackened window. The man staring back was gaunt, hollow-eyed, with prematurely grey hair and the kind of exhaustion that sleep could never cure. He had become a ghost in his own life, going through the motions of existence without truly living. But in the reflection, he could also see the girl behind him, and something was wrong. The fire cast his shadow clearly against the glass, but where Sigrid sat, there was no shadow. Eric spun around, heart hammering, but she was there, solid and real, watching him with those ancient eyes. Thu Surd Thad Lika Ida Ichvad, she asked in Old Norse. You see it too, don't you? Before he could answer, before he could even process what he had seen, or hadn't seen, she spoke again, and this time her voice carried the cadence of another child entirely. A child whose voice lived only in his memories. Papa. The word was Norwegian now, modern, spoken in the exact tone Astrid had used when she was frightened or confused. Papa. Why did you let me burn? The mug of milk slipped from Eric's hands, shattering against the stone floor and a splash of white against grey. The sound echoed through the forge like a gunshot, and somewhere in the village, a dog began to howl. Outside, the aurora borealis pulsed across the sky in violent waves of green and gold, and Eric Thornton realized that his 3 years of carefully constructed isolation were about to end in the most impossible way imaginable: the ordinary world. The silence that followed the shattering of the mug stretched like a taut wire between them. Eric stared at Sigrid, his chest rising and falling in ragged breaths, while she regarded him with those impossibly old eyes that seemed to hold secrets older than the fjords themselves. You didn't say that, he whispered, his voice barely audible above the crackling fire. You couldn't have said that. Sigrid tilted her head, her expression shifting back to that of a confused child. Chvad sagdi egg? What did I say? The return to Old Norse felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Eric seized it, grasping for normalcy in a situation that defied every rational thought. He had misheard. He had to have misheard. 3 years of isolation and guilt could play tricks on a man's mind, make him hear voices that weren't there, make him see shadows where none should exist. Nothing, he said, switching back to Norwegian as he knelt to gather the larger pieces of the broken mug. You said nothing. But even as he spoke the words, he could feel their falseness settling like ash in his mouth. For 3 years, he had maintained his sanity through routine, through the predictable rhythm of a life carefully constructed to avoid exactly these kinds of disruptions. Every morning at dawn, he would stoke the forge fires. By 7, he would have his first cup of coffee, black, no sugar, the bitterness a small penance he paid to each new day. He would work until noon, breaking only for dried bread and whatever preserves remained from his last reluctant trip to the village store. Afternoons brought repairs, not just to the farm tools and horseshoes that sustained his meager income, but to his cottage itself. 3 years of methodical maintenance had transformed the simple stone structure into something approaching pristine condition. He had replaced every loose board, repointed every stone, painted and repainted the shutters until they gleamed like new. Anything to keep his hands busy, anything to silence the thoughts that crept in during idle moments. Evenings were for reading, technical manuals mostly, occasionally the old Norse texts that had once been his passion but now served merely as mental exercise. He would eat simple meals alone at the scarred wooden table Astrid had once used for her homework. He would bank the fires, check the locks, and retire to his narrow bed where sleep came in fragments punctuated by dreams he refused to remember upon waking. It was a life that barely qualified as living, but it was safe, controlled. It demanded nothing of him beyond basic survival, offered no opportunities for the kind of attachment that could be ripped away in the space between a child's scream and the roar of flames consuming everything he had ever loved. The villagers of Svolvær had learned to respect his isolation. Occasionally, Mayor Anderson would make the trek up the mountain path to commission repairs for the village hall or to deliver mail that Eric never requested and rarely read. Mrs. Larson from the general store would sometimes include extra supplies in his orders, a jar of honey, fresh mittens she claimed were surplus stock, small kindnesses that he accepted with minimal conversation and maximum efficiency. They whispered about him, of course. The hermit blacksmith who had once been a promising university lecturer. The broken father who couldn't save his daughter from the house fire that claimed her while he was working late in his forge, too absorbed in his craft to notice the smoke until it was far too late. They meant well, these people who shared his bloodline through generations of stubborn Norwegian ancestry, but their pity felt like salt in wounds that refused to heal. Dr. Hansen, the village physician, had stopped making his monthly wellness checks only 6 months ago, finally accepting that Erik would neither seek help nor welcome intervention. The good doctor had left behind a bottle of sleeping pills that Erik kept in his medicine cabinet like a promise he might someday choose to keep. It was a careful equilibrium, this half-life he had constructed. It required no one, depended on nothing beyond his own ability to maintain the walls he had built between himself and a world that had proven itself capable of unthinkable cruelty. He had his work, his books, his solitude. He had his guilt, polished to a fine sheen through 3 years of careful tending. What he didn't have was room for 8-year-old girls who spoke dead languages and cast no shadows. What he didn't have was tolerance for voices that echoed his lost daughter's cadence. What he didn't have was the strength to survive another loss, another failure, another reminder that love was just another word for the exquisite vulnerability of caring for something the universe could snatch away without warning or mercy. Yet here she sat, this impossible child, watching him clean up broken pottery with an expression that seemed to catalogue every movement, every breath, every crack in the armor he had spent 3 years forging around his heart. Outside, the aurora continued its violent dance across the winter sky, and Erik found himself wondering if his carefully ordered world was strong enough to survive whatever storm was brewing in those ancient, knowing eyes. The sharp fragments of ceramic cut into Erik's palm as he gathered them, the pain somehow grounding him in a reality that seemed to be shifting beneath his feet like ice over deep water. When he looked up, Sigrid was standing directly beside him, having moved from the stool with the same impossible silence that had marked her arrival. "Tu bledir," she observed in Old Norse. "You bleed." Erik glanced at his hand, surprised to see crimson drops falling onto the grey stone. He hadn't felt the cut, hadn't registered the moment when his careful control had slipped enough to let sharp edges pierce skin. 3 years of meticulous self-preservation, and one impossible child had undone his defenses in the span of minutes. "It's nothing," he muttered, but Sigrid was already reaching for him with small hands that should have been soft with childhood but felt calloused in ways that spoke of work no 8-year-old should know. Her touch was warm, impossibly warm for a child who had been wandering barefoot through a blizzard, and when she turned his palm toward the firelight, Erik saw something that made his breath catch. The blood wasn't just red. In the flickering light, it seemed to shimmer with threads of gold, as if the aurora outside had somehow found its way into his veins. "Tu er tangdor," Sigrid whispered, her voice carrying a weight of certainty that chilled him. "You are connected." Before Erik could ask what she meant, the cottage shuddered. Not from wind. He knew every sound his refuge made when winter storms battered the walls, but from something deeper, something that seemed to rise from the earth itself, a tremor that made the metal tools hanging from his forge walls sing in harmonies they had never produced before. The fire in the hearth flared higher, casting shadows that danced wrong, moving independent of the flames that should have controlled them. And in those shadows, Erik saw shapes that made his mind recoil. Ships with curved prows cutting through darkness, figures with axes and torches, buildings consumed in flames that reached toward a sky painted in the same violent aurora that blazed overhead tonight. "No." The word tore from his throat as he jerked his hand away from Sigrid's touch, the visions fracturing like glass. "I don't know what kind of game this is, but—" "Theta ekki leikur." Sigrid's voice carried an authority that no child should possess. "This is not a game." She moved to the window, her bare feet still making no sound, and pressed her small hand against the frost-covered glass. Where her palm touched, The ice began to melt in patterns that looked almost like runes, symbols Eric recognized from his university studies, but had never seen form spontaneously, drawn by impossible heat from a child's touch. "There eru ad koma aftur," she said, her reflection in the window overlapping with Eric's in a way that made them look like father and daughter, or like two souls bound by something stronger than blood. "They are coming again." "Who?" Eric's voice came out as a whisper. "Who's coming?" Instead of answering, Sigrid began to hum. The melody was haunting, ancient, the kind of tune that might have been sung by mothers putting children to sleep in longhouses that had crumbled to dust centuries ago. But woven through the familiar cadence were notes that Eric knew, notes that belonged to a lullaby he had sung to Astrid on nights when thunderstorms made her afraid to sleep alone. The humming grew louder, and with it came another sound, distant at first but growing closer. The rhythmic splash of oars cutting through water, the creak of rope and timber, voices calling to each other in Old Norse, rough with anticipation and bloodlust. Eric stumbled to the window beside Sigrid, his heart hammering against his ribs. The fjord below his cottage was frozen solid, had been for weeks. There was no water for ships to navigate, no way for the sounds he was hearing to exist in any reality he understood. Yet there they were, emerging from the aurora-painted darkness, like memories given form. 3 longships cutting through ice as if it were open water, their dragon prows gleaming with the same golden light that had threaded through his blood. Warriors lined the sides, their weapons catching reflections that had no source, their faces painted with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the strange light. "There kommer fyra mig," Sigrid said simply. "They come for me." The words hit Eric like a physical blow, carrying with them the weight of choice he had spent 3 years avoiding. He could close his eyes, tell himself this was a hallucination brought on by isolation and grief. He could rationalize away the impossible child, the phantom ships, the way reality seemed to bend around her presence like light around a star. He could retreat into the careful numbness that had sustained him since Astrid's death. Or he could step forward into whatever storm was breaking over his carefully constructed world, knowing that some calls to adventure came not as heroic quests, but as chances to choose protection over preservation, love over safety, the terrifying possibility of meaning over the comfortable certainty of emptiness. The ships were closer now, close enough that Eric could see individual faces among the raiders, close enough to realize that one of them wore his own features, twisted by centuries, and rage into something almost unrecognizable. Eric's knees buckled, and he gripped the windowsill to keep from falling. The face staring back at him from the lead longship was his own, yet not his own. Sharper, wilder, marked by scars that told stories of battles he had never fought. The phantom warrior's eyes burned with a hunger Eric recognized but had spent 3 years trying to forget, the desperate fury of a father who had failed to protect what he loved most. "This isn't real," he whispered, backing away from the window. "None of this is real." But Sigrid turned to look at him, and her ancient eyes held pity that cut deeper than any blade. Ranvaroleki, Eric Ironborn. What is reality, Eric Ironborn? The name she used, Ironborn, was not his surname. He was Eric Thornson, son of fisherman, university lecturer turned blacksmith. Yet when she spoke the ancient epithet, something deep in his chest responded like a bell struck in perfect resonance. "I won't do this." Eric stumbled toward the door, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the locks. "I won't lose another. I can't." The cottage shuddered again, more violently this time. Tools fell from their hooks, clanging against the stone floor in discordant symphony. The fire roared higher, casting light that revealed too much, showed him how Sigrid's shadow flickered between that of a child and something else entirely, something with wings that spread across the ceiling like dark promises. 3 years, Eric said, his voice cracking. 3 years I've kept the world out. 3 years of being nothing to no one so that nothing and no one could be taken from me. He turned to face Sigrid, and tears he hadn't shed since Astrid's funeral burned his eyes. "I know what you are. You're a test, a punishment, God's way of asking if I learned my lesson the first time." Sigrid stepped toward him, her small bare feet, somehow steady on stones that trembled beneath Eric's boots. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics of wind through mountain passes, of waves against ancient shores. Tu Heldorad thu hafir valid einsemd, on einsemd valdi thig. You think you chose solitude, but solitude chose you. The words hit him like hammer blows. Because she was right. He hadn't chosen this half-life out of strength or wisdom, he had chosen it out of terror. Terror of caring again. Terror of the moment when love transforms from blessing to weapon, when the universe reveals its capacity for casual cruelty. I was supposed to protect her, he whispered. Astrid. She was 8 years old, just like... He couldn't finish. Couldn't voice the impossible coincidence that this phantom child bore the same age as his daughter, spoke with the same fearless trust that had made Astrid believe her father could shield her from any darkness. The sound of the approaching ships grew louder. Through the window, Eric could see torches blazing aboard the longships, could hear war cries that seemed to come from both the fjord below and somewhere much deeper, the place where guilt carved out caves in a man's soul and filled them with echoes of everything he should have done differently. They're not coming for you, Eric said, the realization hitting him like cold water. They're coming for me. Sigrid nodded solemnly. They're haffa bedid lengi. They're eru tilbunir ad takathad sem their eager. They have waited long. They are ready to take what they are owed. Eric understood then. The phantom warriors weren't raiders from some long-dead past. They were the manifestation of his own self-loathing, given form by proximity to whatever impossible force animated the child before him. They came to collect the debt he owed for his failures, to exact the punishment he had never stopped believing he deserved. Then let them come, he said quietly. I've been waiting too. But even as he spoke the words, another part of him, the part that had once been a father, a protector, a man who believed in the possibility of redemption, whispered a different truth. Sigrid wasn't here to lead him to destruction. She was here to offer him the one thing he feared more than death, a chance to choose differently, a chance to step forward instead of back, to protect instead of abandon, to risk everything for the slim possibility that love might triumph over loss. The ships were almost at the shore now. The phantom Eric raised his weapon, an ancient sword that gleamed with the same golden light that had threaded through his blood, and pointed it directly at the cottage window. In that moment, Eric Thornton faced the choice that would define not just his future, but the very nature of who he had been all along, the coward who let the world burn around him, or the father who would walk into any fire if it meant keeping one small light safe in the darkness. The aurora pulsed overhead like a heartbeat, and Sigrid's hand found his with impossible warmth. The storm was about to break. Eric felt the moment of choice crystallize around him like ice forming on still water, beautiful, fragile, and irreversible. Sigrid's small hand in his carried the weight of eternity, and for the first time in 3 years, he stopped running from what that weight meant. If they come for me, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos building outside, they'll have to go through me to get to you. The words surprised him with their certainty. 3 years of careful isolation, of building walls between himself and any possibility of attachment, crumbled in an instant, because standing there with Sigrid's ancient eyes watching him, Eric finally understood the difference between protecting himself from loss and protecting something precious from the darkness. The phantom ships had reached the shore now, their impossible hulls scraping against ice that should have held them fast but parted like water before their advance. Through the window, Eric could see the warriors disembarking, their spectral forms solidifying as they touched land. The phantom Eric stood at their head, scarred and savage, carrying not just weapons but the accumulated weight of every moment of self-hatred Eric had nursed for 3 years. Tu ertad bretast, Sigrid observed, her voice carrying wonder. You are changing. Eric looked down at his hands and saw she was right. The golden threads in his blood were spreading, visible beneath his skin like veins of light. Where Sigrid's warmth touched him, the transformation accelerated, and he felt something he had thought permanently broken begin to stir back to life. Not just courage, though that was part of it. Something deeper. The fundamental understanding that some things were worth fighting for, worth dying for, worth living for. That love wasn't a weakness to be guarded against, but a strength that could burn away everything false, everything cowardly, everything small about a man's soul. "I can't promise I won't fail you," Eric said, kneeling so his eyes were level with hers. "I couldn't save my daughter. I couldn't save my marriage. I couldn't even save myself from becoming this broken thing. But—" "Thu ert ekki brotin," Sigrid interrupted, her small hand touching his cheek with impossible gentleness. "You are not broken. Thu ert ad vakna. You are awakening." The cottage door exploded inward, torn from its hinges by forces that had nothing to do with wind or weather. The phantom warriors poured through the opening like smoke given form, their weapons gleaming with cold light that cast no shadows. At their head came his dark reflection, the Eric who had surrendered completely to guilt and rage. "Timi til ad borga skuldina," the phantom Eric snarled. "Time to pay the debt." But Eric Thornson was no longer the same man who had cowered in this cottage for 3 years. As the spectral warriors advanced, he stepped forward instead of back, placing himself between them and Sigrid with a certainty that surprised him. The aurora light streaming through the broken doorway seemed to respond to his movement, coiling around him like armor forged from starfire. "The only debt I owe," Eric said, and his voice carried harmonics of hammer on anvil, of iron shaped by will and fire, "is to stop hiding from who I was meant to be." The transformation was complete now. The golden light no longer threaded through his blood, but blazed from every pore, turning his blacksmith's hands into weapons that could forge more than metal. The careful walls he had built around his heart didn't just crumble, they transmuted into something stronger, something that could contain infinite love without breaking. Behind him, Sigrid began to sing, not the haunting lullaby from before, but something older, more primal. A song of fathers and daughters, of protection that transcended death, of love that could reach across centuries to find what it had lost and reclaim it from the darkness. The phantom warriors hesitated, their forms flickering like flames in wind, because they were born from Eric's self-hatred, and that hatred was transforming into something they couldn't comprehend, couldn't touch, couldn't defeat. "Tu vedor ad lyra," the phantom Eric said, but his voice was already growing distant. "You were supposed to learn." "I did learn," Eric replied, advancing toward his dark reflection. "I learned that hiding from love isn't protection. It's just another kind of death. I learned that some things are worth every risk, every loss, every moment of terror that comes with caring. And I learned that redemption isn't something you earn by suffering. It's something you choose by stepping forward when everything in you wants to step back." He reached out and grasped his phantom self by the throat. Where his light-blazed fingers touched spectral flesh, the warrior began to dissolve, not destroyed but transformed, integrated, made whole. "I choose to step forward," Eric said, and felt 3 years of carefully maintained numbness burn away like mist before dawn. The cottage, the phantom warriors, the impossible ships, all of it faded, leaving only Eric and Sigrid standing in a space between worlds, between past and future, between the man he had been and the father he was becoming. There was no going back now. The real journey was just beginning. The space between worlds held them for a heartbeat, then dissolved like morning fog, depositing Eric and Sigrid back in the cottage. But not the cottage as it had been. The walls remained, the forge still glowed, yet everything felt fundamentally altered, as if reality had been rewoven around their transformed bond. Eric's hands still blazed with residual light, and he could feel the change in himself like a sword fresh from the forge, hot, malleable, dangerous in untrained hands. The phantom warriors were gone, but their absence left questions that demanded answers. "Nuna kimor san Khalid," Sigrid said softly. "Now comes the true test." Before Eric could ask what she meant, the cottage door, somehow whole again despite being torn from its hinges moments before, opened to admit a figure that made his breath catch. An elderly woman stepped through, her silver hair braided with leather cords and small bones, her eyes the pale blue of ancient ice. She moved with the careful dignity of someone who had walked between worlds for so long that she no longer fully belonged to either. "Astrid Olafsdottir," the woman said, inclining her head toward Sigrid with formal respect. Then her gaze shifted to Eric, and he felt the weight of judgment behind those ancient eyes. "And Eric Ironborn, though you are only just remembering that name. Who are you?" Eric demanded, stepping protectively in front of Sigrid. The golden light in his blood responded to the perceived threat, warming beneath his skin. "I am Ragnhild the Bridgewalker," the woman replied. "Keeper of the old ways, guardian of the threshold between what was and what might be. And I am here because your transformation has upset the balance that has held for 1,000 years." She moved into the cottage with proprietary ease, her weathered hands tracing symbols in the air that left brief trails of silver light. "When the child appeared to you, when you chose protection over preservation, you set forces in motion that cannot be easily contained. There are others who have felt the shift, others who will not welcome what you are becoming." As if summoned by her words, new sounds reached them from outside. Not the spectral ships of his own guilt, but something more immediate, more corporeal. Engines, vehicles climbing the treacherous mountain road to his isolated cottage. Voices speaking urgent Norwegian. Fragments of conversation carried on the wind. Readings off the charts. Electromagnetic anomaly, centered on government authority to investigate. "Scientists," Ragnhild said with distaste. And worse. The kind who would study the child like a specimen, who would cage her light and call it progress. Her ice-pale eyes fixed on Eric. "They felt the Aurora's response to your awakening. They know something impossible happened here tonight." Eric moved to the window, still keeping Sigrid close. 3 black vehicles were winding up the mountain road, their headlights cutting through the darkness like cold swords. He could make out the shapes of men inside. Men with equipment, with purposes that had nothing to do with wonder and everything to do with control. "How many are there?" he asked. 9 in the first wave," Ragnhild replied. "But they are merely the beginning. When they cannot explain what they find, more will come. The child cannot hide what she is, not anymore. Her true nature blazes too brightly now that you have accepted your role as her protector." Sigrid's small hand found Eric's, and he felt her fear threading through their connection. Not fear of the approaching men, but fear of what her presence had brought down upon him. "Ege ekiad hafa komid hingad," she whispered. "I should not have come here." "No," Eric said firmly, kneeling to meet her ancient gaze. "You came exactly where you needed to be, and I'm exactly who I need to be to keep you safe." He looked up at Ragnhild. "You said there would be others who wouldn't welcome what I'm becoming. Are there any who will?" A ghost of a smile crossed the old woman's weathered features. The old blood remembers, even in these diminished times. There are those who still honor the ancient pacts, who understand that some things are worth preserving against the modern world's hunger to dissect every mystery. She pulled a carved stone from her robes, its surface etched with runes that seemed to shift in the firelight. "This will call them when the time comes. But first, you must learn to wield what you have become." The vehicles were closer now, perhaps 10 minutes away. Eric could feel time crystallizing around them again, another moment of choice approaching. He could surrender, let the officials take Sigrid for study and observation, while he tried to convince the world he was simply a lonely blacksmith who had suffered a breakdown. Or he could trust in the impossible transformation burning in his blood, trust that love could be stronger than fear, that protection could triumph over bureaucracy. "Teach me," he said to Ragnhild. Outside, engines grew louder, and the Aurora pulsed with anticipation. The real tests were about to begin. The ancient woman's hands moved with practiced precision, her weathered fingers tracing patterns in the air that left shimmering threads of silver light. Eric watched, transfixed, as the cottage itself seemed to respond, shadows deepening in corners that hadn't existed moments before, walls subtly shifting to accommodate spaces that defied geometry. "Fyrsta Kenslastundin," Ragnhild murmured. "The first lesson. Power without control is catastrophe waiting to happen. Your blood burns with potential, but potential can consume as easily as create. She gestured toward Eric's forge, still glowing from his earlier work. You understand iron, yes? How it must be heated and cooled, shaped gradually, tempered with patience. I've been working metal for 15 years, Eric replied, though his voice carried uncertainty. The golden light beneath his skin pulsed erratically, responding to his emotional state like a forge fire fed by unstable bellows. Then you know that rushed work shatters under pressure. Ragnhild's pale eyes fixed on him with uncomfortable intensity. The power you've awakened, the power that comes from accepting love despite loss, it follows similar principles. Push too hard, too fast, and you'll break everything you're trying to protect. The sound of approaching vehicles grew steadily louder. 7 minutes, perhaps 8 before they reached the cottage. Sigrid pressed closer to Eric's side, her ancient presence somehow both comforting and concerning. When she was near, the transformation felt natural, inevitable. But Ragnhild was right. Power without understanding was dangerous. Show me, Eric said. Place your hand on the anvil, Ragnhild instructed. Eric approached his forge, the familiar space now feeling foreign with otherworldly energy crackling through the air. The moment his palm touched the worn iron surface, golden light flared from the contact point, racing along the anvil's edges like liquid fire. Feel it, Ragnhild commanded. Don't force it, don't try to control it. Simply feel. The light pulsed, and suddenly Eric could sense everything the metal had ever touched. Every hammer blow, every piece of iron shaped upon its surface, every intention that had guided a smith's hand. More than that, he could feel the ore's journey from deep earth to this moment, could sense the will and purpose that had forged the anvil itself centuries ago. Jarnblod Kenya Jarnshata, Sigrid whispered. Iron blood teaches iron heart. Good, Ragnhild nodded approvingly. You're learning to listen instead of demand. But there's more. She moved to the cottage's window, her weathered hands weaving patterns in the glass that turned it temporarily opaque. The men approaching. They carry fear disguised as authority, fear of what they cannot categorize, cannot control. That fear makes them dangerous. Eric could feel it now, like discordant notes in a symphony. The anxiety radiating from the vehicles below, the rigid determination to reduce mystery to data, to cage wonder in laboratories and filing systems. His protective instincts flared, and the golden light in his blood responded, surging towards something that felt dangerously close to rage. Careful, Ragnhild warned sharply. Anger corrupts the gift. It turns protection into destruction, love into possession. Your phantom warriors were born from that corruption, from the moment you let grief become hatred. The warning hit home. Eric forced himself to breathe deeply, to remember the choice he'd made when facing his dark reflection. Not to destroy what threatened, but to transform it. Not to build walls, but to become a shield that could move, adapt, protect without crushing. Han Lerir Hrat, Sigrid observed. He learns quickly. He has to, Ragnhild replied grimly. The vehicles carry more than curious scientists. There's someone with them who remembers the old stories, who knows what signs to look for. She turned from the window, her expression grave. Dr. Ingrid Haugen. She spent decades researching what she calls folkloric anomalies, instances where ancient beliefs intersect with unexplained phenomena. She felt the shift when you awakened, and she's bringing equipment designed to measure things that shouldn't exist. 4 minutes now. Eric could hear individual engine notes, could sense the occupants' mixture of scientific excitement and professional skepticism. Dr. Haugen's presence felt different from the others, sharper, more focused, carrying the dangerous intensity of someone who had dedicated her life to proving the impossible was merely undiscovered. What do you need me to do? Eric asked. Ragnhild produced 3 more carved stones from her robes, their surfaces crawling with runes that seemed to shift and flow like living things. Hide what cannot be hidden, protect what cannot be defended, and trust what cannot be proven. She pressed the stones into his free hand. When the moment comes, and you'll know it when it arrives, cast these into your forge fire and speak your true name. Not Eric Thornton, the broken blacksmith, but Eric Ironborn, the protector. The first vehicle rounded the final curve, headlights sweeping across the cottage walls. Eric felt Sigrid's hand tighten in his, felt the weight of responsibility and possibility settling on him like armor forged from hope and determination. "Eru kom near," Sigrid announced unnecessarily. "They have arrived." Ragnhild nodded solemnly. "The approach is over. The true test begins now." Outside, car doors slammed with the finality of fate closing its grip upon them. The footsteps on his threshold carried the weight of a world that demanded explanations for every miracle, and Eric felt the golden light in his blood respond to the threat with dangerous intensity. Through the cottage's transformed windows, he could see them clearly now. 9 figures in dark coats, their breath visible in the Arctic air, equipment cases gleaming under the aurora's violent dance. Dr. Ingrid Haugen stood at their center, a woman perhaps 50 with silver-streaked hair and eyes that missed nothing. She moved like someone accustomed to authority, her gaze already cataloging anomalies in the cottage's appearance. The too bright glow seeping from beneath the door, the way the aurora seemed to bend toward their location, the electromagnetic readings that had brought her here. "Hunser of Mikid," Sigrid whispered against his side. "She sees too much." The first knock came, sharp, official, carrying the presumption of answers owed. Eric felt every instinct scream at him to run, to hide, to protect Sigrid from examination and himself from questions he couldn't answer without sounding insane. 3 years of isolation had trained him for concealment, not confrontation. "Eric Thornton," Dr. Haugen's voice carried through the door with professional authority. "Norwegian Institute for Advanced Atmospheric Research. We've detected unusual electromagnetic activity originating from your location. We need to speak with you." Ragnhild's hand touched his shoulder, and her ancient strength flowed into him like cold steel. "Remember what you learned," she murmured. "Don't hide from what you are. Transform what threatens into what serves." The golden light beneath Eric's skin pulsed once, twice, then settled into a steady warmth. He could feel the fear trying to claw its way back into his chest, could hear the broken blacksmith whispering that he wasn't strong enough, wasn't worthy enough to protect anyone. But Sigrid's presence at his side burned away those familiar lies, replacing them with something he had forgotten he possessed: courage. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. "I have to open it," Eric said quietly. "Vid opnum thad saman," Sigrid replied. "We open it together." When Eric turned the handle, he did so not as the broken man who had hidden in these mountains for 3 years, but as someone who had chosen love over safety. The door swung wide, revealing 9 faces etched with professional curiosity and barely contained excitement. Dr. Haugen stepped forward, her eyes immediately cataloguing everything, the impossible warmth radiating from the cottage despite no visible heating source, the way shadows seemed deeper than they should be, the faint luminescence that clung to Eric's skin like residual starlight. "Mr. Thornton," she began, then stopped mid-sentence as her gaze fell on Sigrid. The child stood partially behind Eric, her ancient eyes meeting the scientist's modern ones with serene composure. The aurora light streaming through the doorway seemed to recognize her, bending and swirling around her small form in patterns that made the assembled researchers murmur in wonder and reach for their instruments. "Gaman ad kynnast thur," Sigrid said politely. "Pleased to meet you." The words hit the group like a physical blow. Dr. Haugen's face went pale, her professional composure cracking as she recognized not just the language but the precise dialect, the pronunciation that belonged to a time when Christianity was still fighting paganism for control of Norwegian souls. That's Old Norse," one of the younger researchers whispered, his electromagnetic field detector suddenly screaming warnings as its readings spiked beyond its capabilities. "Not just Old Norse," Dr. Haugen corrected, her voice tight with barely controlled excitement and terror. 10th century Western Norwegian dialect. Pre-Christian linguistic markers, no one has spoken that variant for nearly 1,000 years. Eric felt the moment crystallize around them, felt the weight of impossible truth settling on the assembled scientists like a burden they weren't equipped to carry. Some would try to rationalize, to find explanations that fit within their understanding of the world. Others would want to study, to dissect, to reduce Sigrid to data points and theories. None of them would simply let her be. "You're going to want to come with us," Dr. Haugen said, her scientific hunger overriding any pretense of request. "Both of you. The child needs proper examination. And you," her gaze fixed on Eric with uncomfortable intensity, "you're exhibiting bioelectric phenomena that shouldn't be possible." The golden light in Eric's blood surged, responding to the threat with power that could have reduced the assembled group to ash. For one terrifying moment, he felt the phantom Eric's rage trying to resurface, felt the seductive pull of destruction masquerading as protection. Then Sigrid's hand slipped into his, and her ancient wisdom flowed into him like cool water on forge-heated steel. Not destruction, transformation. Not hiding, transcendence. "No," Eric said simply, and his voice carried harmonics of starfire and iron will. "She's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go." The confrontation he had dreaded for 3 years had finally found him, and he was no longer the broken man who would have surrendered without a fight. Dr. Haugen's expression shifted from scientific curiosity to cold authority, and Eric felt the moment balance on a knife's edge. Behind her, the other researchers began unpacking equipment with practiced efficiency: electromagnetic scanners, thermal imaging devices, recording equipment that would reduce Sigrid's impossible existence to data streams and hypotheses. "This isn't a request, Mr. Thornson," Dr. Haugen said, her voice carrying the weight of institutional power. "Under Article 47 of the Norwegian Emergency Research Protocols, we have authority to investigate phenomena that pose potential risks to public safety. The electromagnetic disturbances emanating from your location have disrupted communications across 3 counties. Eric's protective instincts flared, and the golden light beneath his skin responded with dangerous intensity. He could feel Ragnhild's warning echoing in his mind: anger corrupts the gift. But watching these strangers prepare to dissect the miracle that was Sigrid made his blood burn like molten metal. "Der ottast thad sem their skilja eki," Sigrid whispered, her ancient eyes reflecting sadness that belonged to someone who had watched civilizations rise and fall. "They fear what they do not understand." One of the younger researchers, a man with nervous energy and expensive equipment, stepped forward with what looked like a modified medical scanner. "If we could just take some basic readings," he began, reaching toward Sigrid with the device. The moment the scanner approached within 3 feet of the child, it exploded. Not with fire or force, but with light. Pure, golden radiance that reduced the sophisticated electronics to smoking fragments in seconds. The researcher stumbled backward, his face pale with shock, while his colleagues' instruments began screaming warnings as their own readings spiked beyond measurement. "Fascinating," Dr. Haugen breathed, her scientific excitement overriding any concern for her team's safety. "The child is generating some form of directed electromagnetic pulse. The implications for energy research alone." "She's not a research project," Eric said, stepping fully into the doorway. The aurora above them pulsed in response to his rising anger, and he felt the phantom warriors stirring in the edges of his consciousness, eager for battle, hungry for the destruction of anything that threatened their charge. "Everything is a research project," Dr. Haugen replied, with the casual cruelty of someone who had spent decades reducing wonder to formulas, especially something this unprecedented. "Do you have any idea what that child represents? The potential applications for—" She never finished the sentence. Ragnhild stepped into view behind Eric, her weathered face carrying the authority of someone who had walked between worlds for longer than any of them could imagine. The moment Dr. Haugen's eyes met hers, the scientist's confident demeanor crumbled. Thu, Dr. Haugen whispered, "You." "Hello, Ingrid," Ragnhild said calmly. "Still trying to cage mysteries like butterflies in glass cases, I see." The revelation hit Eric like a physical blow. These two knew each other, had history that stretched back years, perhaps decades. Dr. Haugen's professional mask had fallen away entirely, replaced by something that looked disturbingly like fear. "The Bridgewalker," one of the older researchers breathed. "The Bridgewalker is real." "Very real," Ragnhild confirmed, "and very disappointed in how far you've fallen, Ingrid. There was a time when you understood that some knowledge comes with responsibilities, when you knew the difference between discovery and violation." Dr. Haugen's face flushed with old anger. "You disappeared for 20 years, left me with theories and fragments while the world moved on without us. I had to find my own way, had to prove our research had value beyond folklore and superstition. And in doing so, you forgot the most important lesson," Ragnhild replied sadly, "that not everything that can be studied should be, that some miracles die under too much light." The confrontation between the two women created a strange pause in the surrounding chaos, but Eric could feel the other researchers regrouping, calling for backup on encrypted radios, preparing equipment that looked more like weapons than instruments. Whatever history existed between Ragnhild and Dr. Haugen, it wouldn't stop the institutional machinery that had been set in motion. "Eric," Sigrid said quietly, and the fear in her ancient voice cut through everything else. Not fear for herself, but for him, for the choice she could see him approaching. He could feel it too, the moment crystallizing around them with terrible clarity. The researchers wouldn't leave empty-handed. They couldn't let phenomena this unprecedented simply disappear back into the mountains. And if he tried to fight them here, with conventional force, or even the supernatural power burning in his blood, he would become exactly what they claimed he was: a threat to be contained. But if he surrendered, if he let them take Sigrid for examination, he would lose the only light that had managed to penetrate 3 years of self-imposed darkness. The child who had spoken his daughter's memories, who had shown him that love could transcend death itself, would become another entry in Dr. Haugen's research database. Both choices led to destruction. Both paths ended in failure. The phantom warriors whispered seductively of a third option: burn them all, leave nothing but ash and silence. But that path led to becoming the monster his grief had always threatened to create. All seemed lost, and the aurora danced overhead like a funeral pyre for hope itself. In that moment of crystalline despair, as the aurora writhed overhead like a dying god's last breath, Eric felt something shift deep within his chest. Not the familiar surge of protective rage or the golden fire that had become his shield, but something quieter and infinitely more profound. The truth hit him with the force of a forge hammer striking heated steel. He had been asking the wrong question from the very beginning. Not who hurt you, but who are you hurting by refusing to heal? Sigrid wasn't just a lost child speaking Old Norse, wasn't just a miracle wrapped in ancient memories and impossible knowledge. She was what he had created through 3 years of self-imposed exile, 3 years of choosing guilt over love, punishment over forgiveness. She was the projection of every soul he had failed to save, his daughter, himself, everyone who had tried to reach through his walls of grief, only to find them impenetrable. The cottage around them wasn't glowing with supernatural energy. It was burning with his refusal to let go. "Skilulux," Sigrid whispered, her ancient eyes reflecting not the wisdom of a 1,000-year-old spirit, but the desperate hope of a man's fractured psyche finally recognizing itself. "You understand at last." The researchers, the equipment, Dr. Haugen's institutional hunger, they weren't threats to something external and precious. They were manifestations of his terror that healing meant forgetting, that moving forward meant leaving his daughter behind in a way that death never could. His mind had conjured this elaborate fantasy of transcendent love and supernatural purpose to avoid the simple, devastating truth. Astrid was gone, had been gone for 3 years, and no amount of golden light or phantom warriors or miracle children speaking dead languages could bring her back. "No," Eric breathed, the word torn from somewhere deeper than his throat. The aurora above them pulsed once, twice, then began to fade as the electromagnetic anomalies that had drawn the researchers here started to dissipate like morning mist. Ragnhild's weathered face looked at him with infinite compassion, Not the supernatural wisdom of a mystical guide, but the gentle understanding of a local woman who had been leaving food on his doorstep for months, who had watched him retreat so far into grief that he had created an entirely alternate reality rather than face the emptiness of his cottage. "The mind protects itself in wondrous ways," she said softly, her voice now carrying the warm accent of a lifelong Svolvær resident rather than the archaic tones of an ancient keeper of secrets. "But protection can become a prison if we're not careful." Dr. Haugen stepped forward, and Eric could see her clearly now, not as a threat to be destroyed, but as someone whose professional compassion had brought her into the mountains on reports of a man in crisis. The equipment her team carried wasn't designed to cage miracles, but to monitor the electromagnetic disturbances that severe psychological breaks could sometimes generate in people with specific neurological predispositions. "Eric," Dr. Haugen said gently, "we're here to help. The villagers have been worried about you. Ragnhild Eriksson here has been coordinating with our mental health services for weeks, trying to find a way to reach you." The cottage felt smaller now, mundane, filled with the accumulated debris of 3 years of minimal living. No golden light emanated from the forge. It had gone cold months ago, when he'd stopped even the pretense of maintaining his profession. The anvil was just iron, beautiful in its simplicity, but empty of mystical significance. And Sigrid. Eric looked down at the child whose hand he still held, and saw not an ancient spirit but the face his guilt had projected onto every lost soul he encountered. The face of forgiveness he had been unable to give himself. The absolution he had wrapped in impossible circumstances, because accepting it freely felt like betraying his daughter's memory. "She's not real," he said, the words feeling like they were tearing pieces from his chest. "None of it was real. The love was real," Ragnhild said firmly. "The protection, the choice to shield something precious, that was all real, Eric. You just couldn't direct it toward yourself." The phantom warriors dissolved like smoke, and with them went the weight of supernatural responsibility that had felt so much easier to bear than simple human grief. No ancient curse bound him to this place. No mystical power coursed through his veins. He was just a man who had lost his child and had spent 3 years building elaborate walls around that loss rather than learning to carry it. As Sigrid's form began to fade, not with dramatic supernatural dissolution, but with the quiet release of a mind finally ready to face reality, Eric felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. Peace. Not the peace of magical resolution or mystical purpose, but the simple, devastating, liberating peace of a man who had finally stopped running from his own heart. The aurora continued its dance overhead, beautiful and entirely natural, as Eric Thornson began the long journey back to being human. The silence that followed felt different from the hollow quiet that had consumed Eric's cottage for 3 years. This wasn't the oppressive weight of avoidance, but the clean emptiness that comes after a wound has been properly cleaned, painful but necessary, raw but healing. Eric found himself sitting on the cottage's front step, though he couldn't remember lowering himself down. His legs felt unsteady, as if he'd been walking on phantom ground for so long that solid earth seemed foreign beneath his feet. The research team had withdrawn to a respectful distance, their equipment packed away now that the electromagnetic anomalies had ceased. What remained was just a broken man, and the people who had refused to let him disappear entirely. "How long?" Eric asked, his voice hoarse from the effort of speaking without the protective filter of delusion. "How long have I been?" 3 months, Ragnhild said gently, settling beside him on the step with the careful movements of someone who had earned every one of her 72 years. "Since you stopped answering the door entirely. But you've been slipping away for much longer than that." Dr. Haugen approached with the cautious respect of someone who understood that healing was more fragile than breaking. In the natural light, without the supernatural interpretations his mind had wrapped around her presence, Eric could see the genuine concern in her weathered features. "We've been monitoring electromagnetic disturbances across the region for the past 6 weeks, she explained. The patterns were unlike anything we'd encountered, too organized to be natural, too chaotic to be artificial. When they traced back to this location, She paused, studying Eric's face. I've seen cases like this before, Eric. Isolated individuals with specific neurological structures sometimes generate measurable fields during periods of intense psychological stress. You've been broadcasting your pain across 3 counties. The scientific explanation should have felt diminishing, should have reduced his experience to mere dysfunction. Instead, Eric found it oddly comforting. Even his breakdown had been real enough to affect the physical world. Even his retreat from reality had possessed its own terrible power. The villagers knew, Ragnhild continued. Some of them, anyway. Old Magnus saw you talking to empty air 3 weeks ago when he brought supplies up the mountain path. Young Petra mentioned that you'd been asking after a child, describing a little girl no one had ever seen. We realized you needed help, but... She gestured helplessly. You've always been so self-sufficient, so determined to handle everything alone. Eric thought of all the times over the past months when he'd felt Sigrid's presence most strongly, when the phantom conversations had felt most real. They aligned perfectly with Ragnhild's timeline, moments when isolation and grief had become too heavy to bear without creating something, someone, to help carry the load. I loved her, he said simply, the words falling into the cold air like stones into still water. Astrid. I loved her so much that losing her felt like losing the ability to love at all. And Sigrid, the girl I imagined, she was everything I wanted to believe about love surviving death, about purpose, continuing beyond loss. Love doesn't survive death, Dr. Haugen said, with the gentle authority of someone who had studied human consciousness for decades. It transcends it. The love you felt for your daughter isn't diminished by her absence, Eric. But you've been trying to preserve it by stopping time, by refusing to let it grow and change and find new expressions. The truth of that hit him like a physical blow. For 3 years, he had treated his grief like a shrine to be maintained rather than a wound to be healed. Every day spent in isolation, every conversation declined, every kindness rejected, had been his attempt to preserve Astrid's memory by refusing to live beyond it. What now? The question emerged from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. For 3 years, his future had been measured in hours of endurance, in small victories over the urge to simply stop existing. The idea of planning beyond survival felt as foreign as breathing underwater. Now you remember that you're not alone, Ragnhild said firmly. The village needs its blacksmith, not just for horseshoes and repairs, but because communities require their craftsmen to thrive. You've been missed, Eric. Your absence has been felt. Dr. Haugen nodded thoughtfully. I'd also recommend working with our mental health team. What you've experienced, the complexity of the constructed reality, the electromagnetic manifestations, it suggests a remarkable mind under incredible stress. With proper support, that same capacity for creation could be channeled toward healing rather than hiding. For the first time in 3 years, Eric felt something stirring in his chest that wasn't pain or protective rage, but possibility. The forge in his cottage was cold, but it could be relit. His hands still remembered the rhythm of hammer on steel, the satisfaction of shaping raw material into something useful and beautiful. Will you help me? He asked, the words feeling strange and new in his mouth. After so long insisting he needed nothing from anyone, asking for aid required a courage he hadn't known he possessed. I shall pedeg, Ragnhild said firmly. We will help you. The aurora danced overhead, beautiful and entirely natural, as Eric Thornton took his first real step back toward the world of the living. The journey back to Svolvær took 2 hours through snow that no longer whispered with phantom voices. Eric sat in the passenger seat of Dr. Haugen's research vehicle, watching familiar landmarks emerge from the pre-dawn darkness like old friends he had forgotten how to recognize. The lighthouse that had guided him home from late nights at the forge, the weathered church where he had baptized Astrid 7 years ago, the harbor where fishing boats bobbed in black water, their crews preparing for the day's work with the steady determination of people who understood that life continued regardless of personal catastrophe. Each sight struck him with the dual force of homecoming and exile. These places belonged to the Eric who had existed before, the man who had participated in community dinners, who had crafted weather vanes and garden gates alongside practical metalwork, who had believed that skill and love and careful attention could protect the things that mattered most. That man felt like a stranger now, separated by 3 years of willful isolation and the devastating clarity of recent revelation. "The integration process will be gradual," Dr. Haugen was saying, her voice gentle but clinical. "What you experienced wasn't a simple hallucination, Eric. You constructed an entire alternate framework for processing trauma, complete with historical research, electromagnetic manifestations, and internally consistent mythology. That level of psychological architecture doesn't dismantle overnight." Eric nodded, though he wasn't certain he understood the implications. The cottage already felt like something from a half-remembered dream, and the memory of Sigrid's presence grew fainter with each mile they traveled from the mountains. But the love he had felt for her, protective, desperate, transformative, remained as vivid as ever. Dr. Haugen had called it displaced parental affection, the natural caregiving instinct redirected toward a safe target. The explanation made sense intellectually, but it couldn't diminish the reality of what he had experienced. "Will I forget her completely?" he asked. Ragnhild, who had insisted on accompanying them despite her age and the early hour, reached across from the back seat to squeeze his shoulder. "Would you want to? She was how you learned to love again, Eric. Even if she wasn't real in the way you thought, the emotions she awakened were genuine. The choice to protect something precious, to put another's well-being before your own. Those instincts had been dormant for 3 years. She helped you remember who you used to be." The village emerged around them as full daylight broke across the fjords. Svolvær looked smaller than Eric remembered, more fragile, as if the buildings themselves had aged in his absence. Smoke rose from chimneys where families were beginning their day. Children's voices carried across the square as the school prepared to open. The simple persistence of ordinary life felt both comforting and overwhelming, a reminder that the world had continued functioning while he retreated from it. Dr. Haugen parked outside the medical center, a modest building that served the scattered communities along this stretch of coast. "We'll start with basic assessments today," she explained. "Physical health, neurological function, psychological baseline. Nothing invasive, just establishing where you are now so we can chart a path forward." The prospect should have terrified him. For months, any form of external evaluation had felt like an existential threat, a challenge to the carefully constructed reality that had allowed him to function at all. Now, the idea of professional support felt less like surrender than like setting down a weight he had carried too long. "After that," Ragnhild added, "we'll discuss practical matters. The forge has been maintained. Young Henrik has been keeping the fire ready, cleaning the tools, organizing the workspace. He's been hoping you'd return to train him properly in the craft. Half the village has metalwork waiting for your attention." Eric felt a flutter of something dangerously close to anticipation. He had forgotten the satisfaction of completing projects, of transforming raw materials into objects that served genuine purposes in people's lives. The work had always been meditation as much as labor, a way of channeling energy and attention into creation rather than destruction. But even as hope stirred in his chest, Eric felt the weight of consequences pressing down around him. 3 years of isolation had burned bridges he wasn't certain could be rebuilt. Trust lost, connections severed, responsibilities abandoned. The debris of his retreat would take time to clear. Some relationships might never recover. Some opportunities had been permanently lost. "What if I can't do it?" he asked, voicing the fear that had kept him hidden for so long. "What if I try to return and discover that too much has changed, that I no longer fit?" "Then you'll adapt," Dr. Haugen said simply. "Humans are remarkably resilient, Eric. The same psychological flexibility that allowed you to construct an alternate reality can help you rebuild your connection to this one. It won't be easy, and it won't be quick, but it's possible." The medical center doors loomed ahead, representing the first formal step back toward belonging somewhere larger than his own grief. Eric took a breath that seemed to reach deeper into his lungs than any he had drawn in months. tasting possibility alongside the familiar salt air of home. Behind them, the mountains rose into morning light, beautiful and ordinary, and finally free of ghosts. Standing before the medical center doors, Eric found his hand frozen on the metal handle. The surface was cold beneath his palm, real cold, not the supernatural chill he had been interpreting as otherworldly presence for months. Just Norwegian winter, honest and unforgiving, and entirely natural. Behind him, he could hear Dr. Haugen and Ragnhild discussing practical arrangements in low voices, their words creating small clouds of vapor in the morning air. But their voices seemed to fade as Eric's attention focused inward, where every lesson of the past 3 years was crystallizing into a single, unavoidable moment of choice. Everything he had learned about love surviving loss, about the courage required to protect something precious, about the difference between hiding from pain and healing through it, had brought him to this threshold. The phantom conversations with Sigrid hadn't been madness, he realized now. They had been preparation, each imaginary moment of teaching her metalwork, of comforting her fears, of choosing her well-being over his own comfort had been practice for this, the choice to enter that building and begin the slow work of rebuilding a life worth living. The final test, he whispered, remembering something Sigrid had said in one of their last conversations, before reality reasserted itself. At the time, he had thought she meant some mystical trial involving ancient curses and supernatural redemption. Now, he understood she had been speaking about this moment, the ultimate challenge of choosing vulnerability over safety, connection over isolation, hope over the familiar weight of unprocessed grief. Eric. Ragnhild's voice carried genuine concern. Are you ready? He turned to look at her, this woman who had left food on his doorstep for months, who had coordinated with mental health services when his breakdown became dangerous, who had climbed into the mountains in the pre-dawn cold to help guide him back to himself. Her weathered face held the same compassion he had projected onto his vision of her as a mystical keeper of ancient wisdom. The magic had been real. He had simply misunderstood its source. I'm terrified, he admitted, surprising himself with the honesty. For 3 years, he had refused to acknowledge fear, treating it as weakness that dishonored Astrid's memory. Now he recognized terror as information, evidence that what lay ahead mattered enough to risk failure. Dr. Haugen approached with careful steps, her professional demeanor softened by genuine warmth. Fear is appropriate here, Eric. You're about to reconstruct an entire way of being in the world. If you weren't afraid, I'd be concerned about your judgment. Through the medical center's windows, Eric could see ordinary people engaged in ordinary activities. A nurse updating patient charts, a receptionist answering phones, a janitor methodically mopping floors. The simple persistence of routine healthcare in a remote Norwegian village struck him as its own kind of miracle. Not the dramatic supernatural intervention he had imagined he needed, but the quiet magic of human beings showing up for each other day after day, without fanfare or cosmic significance. When Sigrid was afraid, Eric found himself saying, though he still struggled with referring to her in past tense, I told her that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was choosing to act rightly despite fear. He paused, feeling the weight of his own words. I need to practice what I taught her. His reflection in the glass doors showed a man who had aged beyond his years, hollow cheeks, unkempt beard, eyes that had seen too much loss. But beneath the physical deterioration, he caught glimpses of the person he used to be, the craftsman who took pride in perfect joints and smooth finishes, the father who had read bedtime stories with elaborate character voices, the neighbor who had helped repair storm damage without being asked. That man wasn't dead, Eric realized. He had been buried under 3 years of protective numbness, but he wasn't dead. She's still with me, he said quietly, hand still resting on the door handle. Not as a ghost or a spirit or anything supernatural, but the love I felt for her, the lessons I learned from caring for someone else, those are permanent. They changed me. Ragnhild nodded, understanding. That's how healing works, Kær. We don't forget the people who help us grow. We carry their gifts forward. Eric pulled the door open, feeling its weight resist and then yield to steady pressure. Inside, warm air carried the familiar sense of antiseptic and coffee, while soft voices discussed appointment schedules and treatment options, normal sounds, human sounds. The sounds of a world he had abandoned but which had continued functioning in his absence, waiting for him to find his way back. As he stepped across the threshold, Eric felt something shift in his chest, not the dramatic transformation of supernatural revelation, but the quiet click of a lock releasing. The ultimate challenge wasn't behind him. It stretched ahead in months of difficult work, painful honesty, and the daily choice to engage with life rather than merely endure it. But for the first time in 3 years, Eric Thornson was ready to begin. The medical center's waiting room felt smaller than Eric had anticipated, its walls seeming to contract as he stood motionless just inside the doorway. The antiseptic smell that had seemed welcoming moments before now pressed against him like a weight, and the soft murmur of voices from the reception desk transformed into an incomprehensible buzz that made his skin crawl. Behind him, he could hear Dr. Haugen explaining something to Ragnhild about intake procedures, but their words felt distant, muffled, as if spoken through water. "This is wrong," whispered a voice in his mind. Not Sigrid's gentle encouragement, but something darker, more familiar. "You don't belong here. These people can't understand what you've lost, what you've seen. They'll reduce everything to symptoms and diagnoses, strip away the meaning until nothing remains but pathology." Eric's hand tightened on the door handle behind him. The metal was warming under his grip, losing its honest winter cold, becoming slick with perspiration. Through the windows, he could see the village square where normal people went about their morning routines, unaware that he was standing at the precipice of complete dissolution. How easy it would be to turn around, to walk back into the mountains where the only voice that mattered still echoed in the wind between the peaks. "Mr. Thornson." A young woman in scrubs had approached from the reception desk, her smile professionally kind but utterly without comprehension. "Dr. Haugen mentioned you'd be joining us this morning. I'm Nurse Christensen. Would you like to come back and get started?" "She doesn't see you," the dark voice continued. "Look at her face. She sees a case study, a problem to be processed. Do you really want to become someone's research project, someone's example of rural psychological breakdown?" The room tilted slightly, and Eric felt the familiar sensation of reality becoming negotiable, malleable. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to flicker with an otherworldly rhythm, and for a moment he could swear he heard the distant sound of ocean waves crashing against rocks, the sea as it had sounded 1,000 years ago, wild and untamed and full of ancient power. "Eric." Ragnhild's voice cut through the building unreality like a blade through fog. She had moved to stand beside him, close enough that he could smell the familiar scent of wool and wood smoke that clung to her winter coat. "Look at me." He turned toward her, and her eyes held steady against his gaze, not with professional concern or therapeutic neutrality, but with the unwavering recognition of someone who had known him before grief became his defining characteristic. In her weathered face, he saw reflected not the broken man he had become, but the craftsman who had once shaped metal with patient skill, the father who had read stories with elaborate voices, the neighbor who had helped repair storm damage without being asked. "The voice you're hearing," she said quietly. "It's not mystical wisdom. It's the part of you that learned to survive by retreating. It served its purpose, Kair, but you don't need that protection anymore. Don't listen to her," the darkness urged, more desperately now. "She's trying to take away everything that kept you safe. Without isolation, without the barriers you've built, the pain will destroy you completely. You'll feel everything again, all of it at once." But as the fear crested, Eric felt something else rising to meet it. Not supernatural intervention, but the memory of Sigrid's final words before his constructed reality had dissolved. The courage to face what's real. Whether she had been hallucination or projection or psychological necessity, she had taught him something essential, that running from truth was ultimately more painful than confronting it. Yes, he whispered, the word barely audible. Yes, it will hurt. It will hurt more than anything I've ever experienced. Nurse Christensen looked confused, glancing between Eric and Ragnhild with obvious uncertainty. Dr. Haugen approached more slowly, her expression professionally alert as she recognized the crisis unfolding before her. But the alternative, Eric continued, his voice growing stronger as understanding crystallized, is to spend the rest of my life half alive, protecting myself from connection, from purpose, from everything that made existence worthwhile before loss, convinced me that caring was too dangerous. The fluorescent lights steadied. The distant sound of otherworldly ocean faded back into the mundane hum of medical equipment and heating systems. The waiting room resumed its proper dimensions, becoming simply a small space where people sought help rather than a threshold between realities. Eric looked directly at Nurse Christensen, seeing her clearly for the first time, not as a threat to his carefully constructed defenses, but as another human being doing difficult work with compassion and skill. "I'm ready," he said, and released his grip on the door handle. The dark voice tried once more to assert itself, promising safety in retreat, protection in isolation. But Eric had learned something in 3 years of phantom conversations and supernatural projections. Love required courage, and courage required choosing hope over fear, connection over safety, truth over comfortable delusion. As he followed Nurse Christensen toward the treatment rooms, Eric felt the weight of his deepest antagonist. Not ancient curses or mystical forces, but his own terror of living fully in a world where loss was possible. The real confrontation had finally begun. The examination room was smaller than Eric's workshop, its sterile white walls reflecting the overhead fluorescent lights in harsh, unforgiving angles. As Nurse Christensen closed the door behind them, the soft click of the latch seemed to echo with finality. Eric sat on the edge of the examination table, the paper beneath him crinkling with every small movement, while Dr. Haugen arranged her notes and equipment with methodical precision. "We'll start with basic questions," she said, her voice gentle but professional. Simple assessments to establish baseline cognitive function and emotional state. But as she spoke, Eric felt something shifting in the room's atmosphere, not the supernatural presence he had grown accustomed to, but something equally profound, the weight of absolute truth. For 3 years, he had crafted elaborate explanations for his retreat from the world, constructing narratives about grief and healing that allowed him to avoid the most fundamental reality of his situation. "The night Astrid died," he said suddenly, interrupting Dr. Haugen's prepared questions. His voice sounded strange in the clinical space, roughened by months of isolation. "I wasn't home." Dr. Haugen's pen stilled against her notepad. "Eric, we don't need to—" "Yes, we do." The words came faster now, as if a dam had burst inside him. "Everyone said it wasn't my fault. The fire investigators, the funeral director, the neighbors who brought casseroles for weeks afterward. They all said there was nothing I could have done, that electrical fires happen without warning, that being at the village council meeting that evening was just unfortunate timing." The fluorescent light overhead seemed to buzz louder, or perhaps his hearing had sharpened with the intensity of what he was finally allowing himself to acknowledge. Through the small window, he could see the village square where normal life continued, people walking to work, children playing, the mundane persistence of existence that had felt impossible to him for so long. "But I chose to be there," Eric continued, his hands clenching into fists against his thighs. "The meeting was about the new fishing regulations, nothing urgent, nothing that required my specific input. Astrid had been fighting a cold all week. She'd asked me to stay home that evening, said she felt uneasy being alone, and I told her she was being silly, that 8-year-olds were old enough to spend 2 hours by themselves, that I had civic responsibilities." Dr. Haugen set down her pen entirely, her professional assessment forgotten in the face of what was unfolding. This wasn't the gradual revelation she had planned to coax from him over weeks of careful therapy. This was volcanic, 3 years of suppressed truth erupting all at once. "The council meeting was boring," Eric said, his voice breaking. "Tedious discussions about quotas and licensing fees. I spent the entire evening thinking about how I could have been home reading to her instead, helping with homework, just sitting together while she recovered from her illness. I knew I had made the wrong choice before I even arrived at the village hall. The room seemed to contract around him, but not with the mystical distortion he had experienced in the waiting area. This was the weight of absolute honesty, the crushing pressure of admitting what he had hidden even from himself during his most isolated moments in the mountains. When I saw the flames from across the village, he whispered, my first thought wasn't fear for her safety. It was the knowledge that I had failed the most basic test of fatherhood. I had chosen obligation over love, duty over devotion, and she died alone because of that choice. Dr. Haugen leaned forward, her clinical training warring with human compassion. Eric, you couldn't have known. That's the sacrifice, he interrupted, finally understanding what Sigrid had been trying to teach him through all those phantom conversations, not some dramatic gesture or mystical offering. The sacrifice is admitting that I failed her when she needed me most, and choosing to live with that knowledge instead of hiding from it. The truth settled around him like lead, heavier than any burden he had carried during his retreat into madness. All the supernatural explanations, the ancient curses and mystical redemption narratives he had constructed, they had been elaborate mechanisms to avoid this moment of absolute accountability. I built an entire fantasy around protecting a lost child, Eric said, tears beginning to track down his weathered cheeks. Because I couldn't face the reality of the child I failed to protect. Sigrid wasn't some supernatural gift or psychological healing mechanism. She was my attempt to rewrite history, to prove I could choose love over duty if given another chance. Through the window, clouds were gathering over the fjords, promising another winter storm. But Eric no longer saw omens or mystical significance in the changing weather. Just the natural rhythm of seasons, beautiful and harsh and utterly indifferent to human suffering. The cost of winning, of finally choosing truth over comfortable delusion, was the complete destruction of every story he had told himself about noble grief and meaningful loss. What remained was simpler and more devastating. A father who had made the wrong choice at the crucial moment, learning to live with consequences no amount of penance could undo. Eric sat in the stark examination room, tears still wet on his cheeks, feeling as though he had been turned inside out. The silence that followed his confession stretched between him and Dr. Haugen like a chasm, not the mystical void he had imagined during his months of isolation, but the simple, terrible quiet that comes after all defenses have been stripped away. Dr. Haugen finally spoke, her voice careful but warm. What you just shared, Eric, that took tremendous courage. But I need you to understand something important. She leaned forward, her eyes meeting his directly. Being at that meeting didn't kill Astrid. The fire killed Astrid. But if I had been home, you might have died too. The words hung in the air between them, stark and uncompromising. The fire investigators determined that the electrical fault occurred in the main panel near the front entrance. If you had been home, you likely would have been trapped as well. Your presence wouldn't have prevented the fire, Eric. It would have created 2 victims instead of 1. The rational part of his mind recognized the truth in her words, but 3 years of self-recrimination had carved deep grooves in his thinking. She was afraid that night. She asked me to stay. Children ask parents to stay for countless reasons: loneliness, boredom, the simple comfort of company. You had no way of knowing this particular request carried life or death significance. Dr. Haugen's voice remained steady, professional, but not unkind. If every parent stayed home every time their child expressed unease, society would cease to function. Eric's hands trembled against his thighs. Outside the window, he could see Ragnhild pacing in the waiting area, her weathered face creased with concern. For months, she had left food on his doorstep, had coordinated with emergency services during his worst breakdowns, had climbed into the mountains in the pre-dawn cold to help guide him back to sanity. All of it motivated by simple human compassion, not the mystical destiny he had imagined. "The girl I thought I found," he said slowly. "Sigrid. She felt so real. Hallucinations often do. especially when they serve a psychological purpose. Dr. Haugen made a note on her pad. Your mind created exactly what you needed, a chance to be the protective father you wished you had been. But Eric, you are a good father to Astrid. One evening's absence doesn't erase 8 years of love and care. The words felt foreign, incompatible with the narrative of failure he had constructed. For so long, his identity had been built around the certainty of his culpability. Without that central pillar of guilt, who was he? What defined him? I don't know how to live with this, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. That's why you're here, she replied simply. Learning to live with tragedy, not overcome it or find meaning in it, but simply carry it without being destroyed, that's what we'll work on together. It's not mystical or dramatic, it's slow, difficult, ordinary work. Through the thin walls, Eric could hear the sounds of the medical center continuing around them. Phones ringing, conversations in the hallway, the mundane machinery of healthcare. For 3 years he had rejected this world of ordinary human intervention, convinced that his suffering was too profound for conventional solutions. Now he recognized his arrogance in that assumption. She taught me something, he said, thinking of Sigrid's gentle voice and impossible presence. Real or not, she helped me understand that love doesn't end with death. The capacity to care, to protect, to nurture, those don't disappear because we lose the person who first awakened them in us. Dr. Haugen nodded. Many people find that loss, while devastating, can also reveal strengths they didn't know they possessed. Your experience in the mountains, caring for someone who needed protection, even if it was a projection of your own psyche, that demonstrates something important about who you are at your core. Eric felt something loosening in his chest, not the dramatic release of supernatural intervention, but a quieter shift, like a muscle that had been clenched for too long finally beginning to relax. What happens now? Now we begin the real work, she said, consulting her notes. Regular sessions, probably twice a week initially. Medication to help stabilize your mood while you process trauma. Gradual reintegration with the community. Not as penance, but because isolation has become harmful rather than protective. The prospect terrified him. 3 years of solitude had made normal human interaction feel impossibly complex and threatening. But beneath the fear, Eric detected something he had almost forgotten existed, curiosity about what lay ahead. The future, which had been foreclosed by grief, was slowly becoming possible again. I'm still afraid, he said. Good, Dr. Haugen replied. Fear means you're engaging with reality instead of retreating from it. We'll work with the fear, not against it. Eric nodded, feeling the weight of beginnings settle around him. The immediate crisis was over, the supernatural explanations dissolved, the elaborate defenses dismantled. What remained was simpler and more challenging. A damaged man learning to rejoin the world of the living, carrying his loss not as punishment, but as proof of his capacity to love. 6 months later, Eric stood in the doorway of Olsen's Hardware, watching the afternoon light slant through the village square. His hands, no longer trembling with the constant anxiety that had plagued him through winter, gripped a list of supplies, materials for the children's playground equipment the community council had commissioned him to build. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same civic responsibilities he had once chosen over his daughter were now drawing him back into the world, but differently this time. Not from obligation or guilt, but from a genuine desire to create something lasting for the next generation. Eric. Magnus Olsen emerged from behind the counter, his weathered face breaking into the kind of smile reserved for old friends. The metal brackets came in yesterday. Quality stock. They'll hold strong through anything these coastal storms can throw at them. The easy familiarity of the greeting would have overwhelmed him months ago, when every human interaction felt like navigating a minefield of potential triggers and breakdowns. Now, while still challenging, it felt manageable. Dr. Haugen had been right about the slow, ordinary nature of healing. Each conversation became fractionally easier, each venture into public spaces less exhausting. The children will appreciate sturdy swings, Eric replied, accepting the heavy box Magnus handed across the counter. Astrid always complained when the old chains would twist and catch. He had learned to speak her name naturally again, without the sharp intake of breath that once accompanied any reference to his daughter. She remained present in his thoughts, but no longer as the burning center of guilt and self-recrimination. Instead, she had become what Dr. Haugen called a continuing bond, the part of love that persists beyond physical presence. As he loaded the supplies into his truck, Ragnhild appeared at his elbow with the stealth that only longtime neighbors could manage. "Lunch tomorrow?" she asked, the casual invitation carrying months of careful rebuilding between them. "Harold caught more cod than we can possibly eat, and you know how he gets when his generosity goes unappreciated." Eric smiled, remembering when such invitations had felt like insurmountable social obligations. Now they simply represented what they had always been, friends caring for friends in the quiet, persistent way that defined village life. "I'll bring bread from the bakery, the kind with seeds that Harold pretends to hate, but always finishes first." "Good man." Ragnhild squeezed his shoulder briefly, then headed toward the post office with the efficient stride of someone managing a dozen small errands. Driving through the village, Eric noticed changes that would have been invisible to him during his isolation. New families had moved in, drawn by the remote beauty and slower pace. The fishing fleet had acquired modern equipment that made the ancient harbor look like a museum display interrupted by progress. Life had continued, adapted, evolved, not cruelly indifferent to his suffering, but simply following the natural rhythms that predated his grief and would continue long after it. His workshop, once a shrine to abandonment, hummed with activity again. Not the frantic productivity of someone fleeing inner demons, but the steady, thoughtful work of a craftsman who had remembered why he loved shaping metal in the first place. The playground equipment was his largest commission in years, but smaller projects filled his days. Repairs for neighbors, custom pieces for the growing tourist trade, the patient restoration of tools and household items that connected him to the community's daily life. The evening therapy sessions with Dr. Haugen had evolved too, becoming less crisis intervention and more exploration of how to build meaning from loss, without requiring that loss to serve some greater purpose. They had discussed the difference between healing and recovery, the first being adaptation to a new reality, the second being a return to an old one that no longer existed. "Astrid will always be 8 years old," he had told Dr. Haugen during their last session. "She'll never grow up, never graduate, never have children of her own. I'll never stop missing those experiences we won't share. But I can choose whether that missing becomes destructive or whether it honors what we did have together." Now, pulling into his driveway as the sun set behind the fjords, Eric felt the truth of that choice settling into his bones. The mountain cabin where he had lived through his breakdown stood empty now, reserved for weekend retreats when the village felt too crowded, or when he simply wanted to remember the strange peace he had found in isolation. Inside his restored house, he prepared dinner with the unhurried care of someone who had learned to find satisfaction in simple routines. The rooms no longer felt haunted by absence, but inhabited by memory, photographs that brought comfort instead of pain, furniture that carried the warmth of shared experiences rather than the weight of loss. As darkness fell over Svolvær, Eric settled into the chair where he had once read bedtime stories, now occupied with sketching plans for the playground's final elements. Tomorrow would bring its own small challenges and modest victories. He would continue the slow work of learning to be fully alive in a world where loss was possible, carrying his love for Astrid not as burden but as proof that some things transcend even death, the capacity to care, to create, to choose hope over fear. The return was complete, not to who he had been, but to who he was becoming. The autumn aurora painted the sky in sheets of green and gold, more gentle now than the violent displays that had marked Eric's darkest winter. He stood on his porch, coffee steaming in the crisp air, watching the children test the playground equipment he had finished installing that afternoon. Their laughter echoed across the village square, pure, unself-conscious joy that no longer pierced him with remembrance of what was lost, but filled him with quiet satisfaction for what had been created. Astrid would have been 11 now. Sometimes Eric allowed himself to imagine her among these children, racing for the swings or attempting increasingly ambitious feats on the climbing structure. The pain of those thoughts had softened into something bearable, not the sharp blade of self-recrimination, but the gentle ache of love that persists beyond presence. "Papa, watch!" a voice called from the playground, and Eric turned to see little Marja Larsen hanging upside down from the monkey bars, her blonde braids swinging free. Her father, Nils, stood nearby with the alert posture of parents everywhere, ready to intervene if necessary, but allowing his daughter the dignity of her own small risks. Eric waved, remembering when such scenes had been impossible to witness. Dr. Haugen had prepared him for moments like these, the unexpected triggers, the waves of grief that could still arrive without warning. But she had also taught him that healing didn't require the absence of pain, only the ability to experience it without being consumed by it. The workshop behind him glowed with warm light, its windows revealing the silhouettes of new projects in various stages of completion. Word of his craftsmanship had spread beyond Svolvær, bringing commissions from neighboring villages and even tourists who wanted to take home something authentic from their northern sojourn. Each piece he created carried a small portion of his daughter's memory, not as memorial, but as continuation of the care and attention to detail she had watched him practice throughout her short life. Inside the house, the phone rang with its familiar persistence. Eric answered to find Dr. Haugen's voice, warm with the professional friendliness that had evolved into something approaching genuine affection over their months of work together. "I'm calling to check on the playground dedication," she said. "How did it feel, seeing your work being used as it was intended?" Eric smiled, settling into the chair that had become his evening sanctuary. "Good, really good. There's something profound about creating something purely for joy, no function beyond bringing happiness to children who will never know my name." "And how are you managing the anniversary approaching?" she asked, referring to the 3-year mark of Astrid's death, now only weeks away. "Differently than I expected," Eric admitted. "Instead of dreading it, I find myself planning. I want to plant a tree in the memorial garden behind the church, something that will grow and change, provide shade and beauty long after everyone who knew her has passed on." They spoke for a few more minutes about his continued progress, the gradual reduction in session frequency that marked his transition from crisis recovery to long-term maintenance of mental health. When he hung up, Eric felt the familiar gratitude for the ordinary miracle of professional competence applied with human compassion. The village around him had fully settled into evening rhythms. Lights appeared in windows like gentle beacons, families gathering for dinner, children reluctantly abandoning the playground for homework and bedtime routines. The mystical isolation he had once craved now seemed less appealing than this simple participation in communal life. His own dinner was modest but carefully prepared. Fish from Harold's morning catch, vegetables from the greenhouse cooperative, bread baked by hands that had learned to find meditation in routine domestic tasks. Eating alone no longer felt like punishment, but like chosen solitude, rich with the possibility of company when desired. As full darkness settled over the fjords, Eric opened his sketchbook to a fresh page. Not for playground equipment this time, but for the small memorial he planned to create beside Astrid's tree, a simple bronze plaque with her name and dates, surrounded by metal flowers that would catch morning light and cast gentle shadows. Something beautiful and permanent, but not grandiose. Proportional to the life it honored. The work consumed him peacefully, the way all meaningful work should. Outside, the aurora continued its ancient dance, indifferent to human joy or sorrow, but somehow encompassing both. Eric no longer searched the lights for signs or portents. They were simply beautiful, part of the same natural world that had produced his daughter's laughter and his own capacity to love her still. When he finally set aside the sketches and prepared for sleep, Eric felt the deep satisfaction of a day well lived, not dramatically or heroically, but with attention and care. Tomorrow would bring its own small challenges and modest rewards. The memorial garden needed planning. The workshop held projects awaiting completion. Friends expected his company for dinner. He was no longer the man he had been before tragedy struck. nor the broken recluse he had become in its aftermath. He was something new, someone who carried loss without being defined by it, who had learned that love's truest expression is not protection from harm, but the courage to remain open to beauty despite knowing it can be taken away. The transformation was complete, not through mystical intervention, but through the patient work of choosing life over and over again, one ordinary day at a time.